Thanks so much for tuning into the show today. Today's podcast will be about exercise programming. Before we get into the show today, just wanted to give you an outline for the rest of Season 2. This episode begins a 3-part series for programming. This will be an overview episode. The second episode of this series will be about periodization and progressions. The third episode in this series will be about conditioning and energy system training. I will also be continuing the regular pattern of alternating solo episodes with guest episodes. So the 3-part series will be split up by guest episodes. The remainder of Season 2, I'll be having on various athletes on the podcast to share their training experience and everything they've learned along the way. I'll have a variety of sports covered, so tune in to the rest of Season 2 and hope you enjoy the episode today. Hello and welcome to the Kingdom Strength Podcast. My name is Troy Briscoe, your host. Thank you for tuning in today. So excited that y'all are here listening in. Today will be a rather quick episode, just a solo podcast about exercise programming. So if you are someone who enjoys going to the gym and moving their body and achieve certain adaptations, then you are in for a treat today. Fairly simple principles and concepts today. So if you have a background in exercise programming, then it'll be just some reminders for you here today. Still worthwhile to tune in, but it'll be some concepts, principles about programming, and then some variables you can manipulate to achieve certain goals and what it might look like to program for particular adaptations. And we'll get into some common misconceptions or mistakes people may make when programming for themselves. So this is just coming from my perspective as a personal trainer and coach of, like 8-ish years, if my math is mathing right now. Worked with various athletes and clientele across the board, different sports, as well as different ages and geriatric populations as well. You name it, I've had some experience with working with some different individuals, as well as weight loss clients and hypertrophy strength clients. So it's fun to get to work with a diverse group of people, a diverse demographic. It's truly an honor to get to help people achieve their goals. So my hope for you today is whether you're programming for yourself or programming for another individual, that you can have some takeaways from this episode here today. Alrighty. A lot of these concepts and principles, like I said, I've learned through time of practicing programming myself, but as well as through studies, through personal trainer certification and the NSCA, CSCS for strength conditioning, and then some other courses along the way, as well as some conversations and discussions with people in the field as well. But like I said, today will be a rather simple view of programming and just to kind of get the ball rolling and maybe some concepts that you might be confused about. So it's never a bad thing to kind of go back to the basics as well. So hope today can light the fire a little bit to learn more and dig a little deeper as well. So we're just kicking off today with just one little central message of the show today, which is that every exercise program is simply an organized manipulation of stress to create a desired adaptation. That is the point I want to hit home with what a program is. It's an organized manipulation of stress on the system, on the body, to create desired adaptation. Whatever the adaptation may be, if it's a certain athlete training for a competition or someone simply trying to gain muscle mass, there's adaptation there, and the way that you structure a program and periodize the program helps you achieve a certain goal effectively, efficiently, and to mitigate the risk of confounding adaptations or variables and injury risk, things like that. There's so many different ways to go about programming, so many different ways to go about organizing and structuring a plan, exercise plan, all the way from a macro cycle down to what you do each day. So many different ways to go about it. So I'll just be presenting some ideas and concepts behind different ways you could potentially go about it. So when we are structuring a program, I like to organize it into kind of three different groups, if you will, that are within each other. So we have a macro cycle, and then we have mesocycles, and then we have microcycles. So the macro cycle is the full scope, the general overview that you are keeping in mind. So when you sit down with a client or for yourself and you're making the whole general game plan, it is a bird's eye view as to how you're going to piece things together. And of course, keeping in mind the goal. The first question you ought to ask is, what is the goal? How am I going to achieve said goal within the framework that the individual can operate under? For example, what is their schedule like? What do they have time for? What constraints do you have within that realm? So you have the macro cycle. You're making a general year. Usually it's a year plan is what a macro cycle would be, traditionally speaking. Just to make things easy, let's just roll with that. So you kind of have the year plan, and then the mesocycles, you can block it up however you want. I usually like to do months is how I block it up, and then the microcycles would be with like the weeks within that month, for example. So however you want to organize it, that best fits you and your preference, that is the way to go. But that's just kind of the general lay of the land that I like to organize before I get into filling in the pieces. It's always good to start with a framework and a foundation in order to build upon and let the pieces come together. So we talked about the whole plan there. Macrocycle, the mesocycles, microcycles. And you might be asking yourself, okay, well, I have kind of the general outline of what a program might look like. What do I do from there? So when you're deciding where to go, as far as filling the things in, of course, you have the goal, and you have different adaptations you could be working on. And how you achieve that goal is dependent on many different factors, like I mentioned. But the way you go about it, a key term here that we can describe is periodization. And periodization is simply how you're spacing out or organizing or switching the styles of training or adaptations or stimulus that you're putting into the tissues and system, so that you're almost building on each other to get to that goal. So again, we're taking a broad view. When you're training for something or working with an athlete or building a program for yourself for like a marathon or a high rocks or whatever it may be, you, from a general sense, you're starting very broad, and then you're getting more sport specific as you get into the event that you're going for. And this is very easily applied to sports because there's a certain time when there is a season associated with said sport. So, of course, sports are different. Seasons are long for some sports, shorter for other sports. But during kind of the traditional off season, right, you may be working on deficits that the athlete may have. Of course, it should be individualized, a program, but if you're working with the team, then there's certain generalizations you can make for adaptations for a particular sport. But off season tends to be very general, and then you're getting more sport specific as you hit the season. So kind of starting with more your hypertrophy, and then getting to strength, getting into your speed strength, and then your power plyometrics, and then boom, you got the season. So the power plyometrics are a little more transient, and so that tends to be a little bit closer to the season for a shorter period of time. Whereas the hypertrophy, you can stack a little bit longer throughout the off season and then kind of build that base to go from there. And again, say it's someone that isn't an athlete, and then you have maybe like a weight loss goal or something like that, then you're not necessarily trying to capitalize on a particular adaptation other than leaning out a little bit, or a classic term that you hear clients say is tone up a little bit. And what you're seeing here is, okay, we can set a plan as far as a healthy way to lose some weight, and generally 1 to 2 pounds per week is the general recommendation to do it in a healthy, slow way in order to make it more sustainable and being able to be maintained throughout the into the future, and kind of more slowly changing a quote unquote set point for someone's weight there, and getting their body used to a different amount of lean versus fat mass. So no matter how you want to frame it, there are different goals that you might be trying to achieve, but the program is based on the goal and how you're trying to build that adaptation, and you can achieve it with structuring in different ways, that periodization to build on certain adaptations, to layer different things in order to mitigate the risk of injury, mitigate the risk of fatigue and overtraining, and also if you're just a general pop client, to also keep things fresh and more exciting. Awesome. So a little bit more about that periodization word that I was describing. Periodization, there's different ways to go about it too. Kind of the traditional way to go about it is linear periodization, which is where, like I said, you're starting more general with kind of higher volume, more hypertrophy work, and getting into more of your strength and then plyometric work. So from a general sense, volume is decreasing over time, intensity is increasing over time. From a sports standpoint, that tends to be what happens as you get closer to the season. There are certain variables you could do a reverse linear periodization. That's another way you can use periodization. So what reverse linear periodization is, it's just the opposite. You will start with a little bit more of the intensity and then you'll gain more volume as you go on. I like to implement certain aspects of this with a marathon training, for example, where I build a little bit more of VO2 max in short intervals early on, where people tend to have not necessarily more capacity to do so, but their tissues are able to handle a little bit lower amount of volume, and the shorter intervals is a great way to increase VO2 max, and then you can slowly increase that aerobic load and adaptation that you're trying to build in tissue endurance as well as you go about the program there. So a marathon program might be an example where you might want to implement certain strategies with reverse linear periodization. And then you have a periodization style called undulating periodization. This is when there are mixed adaptations or multiple adaptations that you are wanting to achieve within a program. So this, high rocks or hybrid athletes are really common these days. That's been all the hype lately. So you're trying to capitalize on multiple demands. So it's not as effective as choosing one demand, obviously, because, you're not focusing on one specific adaptation. You simply can't fully capitalize on multiple at the same time. But it is also a fun way to train for a lot of people and provides different stimulus throughout the week. And a way that this could look would be, for example, like Monday you do a strength workout, and then Wednesday you do a hypertrophy resistance training session, and then Friday you end the week with a bit of power and plyometrics. So within 1 week you are training different qualities. So that will include different intensities and volume. So for the strength day, you'll have higher intensity, lower volume, hypertrophy, a little bit more volume, and then the power plyometrics, you're moving load quickly, so tends to be a little bit lower reps, but lower intensity compared to the strength, but a little bit higher intensity compared to the hypertrophy. You're also doing things that might accrue ground contact times and quick powerful movements. So that is a way to go about it and capitalize on different demands. At this point, just a little recap so far on this monologue from my end about programming. It is a very, very broad topic, and it's just something I enjoy and am passionate about. So I didn't necessarily come in here with a huge outline or game plan, just kind of riffing off the cuff with what I find to be helpful strategies or concepts that I want to communicate to y'all who may be wanting to learn more about programming concepts. So far, what we've covered is what programming is, what exercise programming is, the definition of it, what periodization is, and how that can be applied to achieve certain adaptations. We've talked about the structure of a program and how you might want to do it and look at it from a general framework standpoint. And then we looked at different adaptations that you could focus on within a program and how you might use periodization to achieve a specific adaptation. So from here, while we're talking about adaptations, we talked a little bit about strength, hypertrophy, power, things like this. So let's talk briefly about what different adaptations might be that you're trying to achieve, and some basic concepts when it comes to applying these to a program. So we talked about strength. Generally speaking, you're going to want to have higher intensity, so higher loads. You can use percent rep max, doing like a sub submax test in order to do calculations for what your 1 rep max might be. And at the start of a program, a certain percentage of that rep max, for example, for strength, you might start around like 83% rep max and then build your intensity over a strength block. And then at that point, increase that intensity and decrease the volume over time for a, 1 or 2 block or mesocycle of strength. So that could be, hey, for 2 months, you're working on strength and you're increasing that intensity over time. Great way to utilize linear periodization. And then we could talk about hypertrophy. So that will be more of a volume-based progression. So with hypertrophy, what could be important to note too is the amount of volume you are accruing within a week. So for example, a general recommendation for beginners is to accrue roughly like 10 to 12 sets per week on a given exercise. And then for intermediate lifters, perhaps like 12 to 15 sets per week on a particular exercise. And then advanced lifters could accrue anywhere from 15, 20 sets per week for a given exercise. That's just a general rule of thumb when it comes to trying to manage load and manage volume within the context of resistance training, but particularly with hypertrophy focus potentially. As we talked about strength, hypertrophy, now endurance is another adaptation you could attempt to train within a program. So generally when you think endurance, you think more of like endurance athletes with marathons, Ironman, races like this, where you're actually doing a lot of cardiorespiratory training. So general idea here, again, increasing volume over time, because you can imagine a lot of people run into injuries when their tissue isn't ready to tolerate the demand that you're placing on it, prepping for an event. So this is when I was talking about the reverse linear periodization earlier, but potentially utilizing some components of that when implementing a program for endurance. And you also can talk about muscular endurance. So it's another adaptation you could try to weave into a program, even with endurance athletes. So that will be anywhere from like 12 plus reps. When we're talking strength, we're talking sub 6-ish reps. Hypertrophy is classically like your 8 to 12 repetitions, and then the endurance, traditionally 12 plus to train that adaptation, right? So you're accruing a lot more repetitions per set, and naturally will have a little bit lower amount of sets because you have a lot of volume when you're doing more of the higher volume training. So that's something I like to do when we're talking about the endurance athletes a little bit earlier on in the program, because that'll help the mitochondrial production and the muscles working under fatigue. And then I like to, of course, weave in strength training too as that volume gets up within the program for example, like a marathon athlete, because you want to maintain that tissue robustness and tissue quality and getting load to the muscles and tendons and everything when you're in that sort of goal with working on the endurance adaptations. There, it's still good to put load through tissue and strengthen tissue. Just because you weave in other adaptations and other stimulus that might not be the goal, it doesn't mean you're working against the goal. It's just layering things in to better help the system achieve the goal. And that's another key point too, is just because you have a primary adaptation you're trying to achieve, you can still layer in other stimulus within that program to help maintain tissue stiffness, tissue robustness, and help the system be even more prepared for the demands you're placing on it with whatever the competition may be. So for that marathon example, it's okay to sprinkle in the strength training. It's good to sprinkle in the strength work and put load through range of motion to the tissues to help maintain the tissues. And then this can help with running economy and in actual quality of the tissue itself, rather than just working on endurance throughout a program for an endurance athlete, right? So totally okay to do. And that's the idea of periodization again. I like to repeat myself when it comes to communicating concepts. That periodization, you are not doing one adaptation the whole time. You're building on adaptations, and for example, you can start with a hypertrophy block, strength block. You can even go back to hypertrophy block, keep doing this, strength into power, et cetera, et cetera. So you're not just, it's not like just a spectrum that you're going from one adaptation to another. You can sprinkle it in even within one block that is primary strength, or one block that's primary endurance, or one block that's primary hypertrophy or primary power. You're still having components of different stimulus within that block. You can still have a primary focus with still working on other adaptations as well. When you're talking about more of that, when I was talking about the hybrid athlete situation earlier with the undulating periodization, that's when it's true. Hey, you're trying to maintain multiple adaptations at one time. So that's different than weaving in some strength compound movements at the start of a week within one endurance or hypertrophy block. That's just helping support the system that's producing the adaptation of endurance or hypertrophy. So anyway, that was a long-winded way to explain, hey, it's okay to sprinkle in other strategies to help support the goal. A different way to think about it is helping drive one adaptation by generally bringing up the system's capacity and having an efficient system across the board from an energy system standpoint. I hope you're enjoying this show so far. Just wanted to take a brief moment to say if you are enjoying this content or have enjoyed the content on the podcast in the past. I also put out other content on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, you name it. I have content relating to exercise science, human performance, the Christian walk, something that may fit your interest. So look up my name, Troy Briscoe, or Kingdom Strength Institute on those platforms and check it out. In the meantime, enjoy the rest of the show. Alrighty, so at this point, little bit of a continuation of the recap there. We talked about definition of programming. We talked about periodization. We talked about different adaptations that you can work on within a program. We talked a bit about what that might look like with executing sets, reps, etc., to help support the adaptations in question. Now I'm going to take a moment to just kind of go back to some basics with general principles of exercise programming. One being specificity. So you may have heard it as specific adaptations to imposed demands. This is a huge principle within exercise programming, meaning that the body will respond to the demands placed on it. For example, heavy loading will improve maximal strength. High velocity movements will improve power. Sustained aerobic work will improve endurance, etc., etc. So all these things that we have talked about before, just with the adaptations, all behind the principle of specificity. Makes sense, right? Keeping the goal, like we talked about earlier in this episode. Another quick principle to discuss is progressive overload. This is relating to the topic earlier when we were discussing linear periodization. So progressive overload piggybacks on that conversation where you are starting with one adaptation or goal and then slowly increasing whatever it may be, intensity, volume, like we talked about earlier with periodization. But the progressive overload can be applied to whatever adaptation you're trying to go for. So progressive overload, as it very simply can be deduced from the title of the principle, you are slowly over time increasing the demand, whether that is intensity or volume or frequency or movement complexity, you name it. It's a progression over time. And as you may guess, the purpose of this is to get the system, get your body used to the demands as you're increasing it. So if it happens too quick, you expose yourself for potential injury because your tissues that aren't ready for a certain demand can get irritated when you apply load that it isn't ready for. Very simple concept that I do not need to explain because y'all are smart and understand that if you do something too quick, you might get hurt. Easy peasy. Next principle to highlight is individualization. So very simply put, no two athletes are the same. They respond to stimulus differently. Different athletes may have different compensations or strategies that they're using to move. Different individuals might have a different training age, different injury history to consider as far as tissue preparedness, different movement competency that kind of goes into the compensation piece that I was talking about earlier. Different people have different goals, different lifestyle constraints, different preferences when it comes to training. So everyone is different. That's why a program will look different person to person. Unless you're programming for a team or a group, every program should reflect the individual's goal, preferences, tissue capacity, life constraints, training age, where they're at, which is what makes it exciting. This is what makes me excited to get to program for people, because it's like it's a puzzle pieces together to achieve a certain goal, but it can vary so much. It's like a form of art where you are formulating pieces together in order to, like I said, achieve the goal in a way that would be most effective and beneficial for them, in a way that is enjoyable for the individual as well. So I find it fun, I find it exciting, and I hope y'all do too. Another principle is variation, and this is simply where you can talk about periodization again, where you're doing different mesocycles or different blocks so that the system gets different stimulus for the purpose of making it enjoyable, but also not overloading particular tissue with the same thing over and over again. So with how I like to select variation within exercises is within a block or mesocycle, I will have exercises for each workout for each day. They're different each day depending on the split that the individual is utilizing, that I'm giving to an individual, and the goal of said workout. And again, depending on the goal of the workout, if it's a strength focused workout or hypertrophy focused workout, the sets and reps and rest will indicate that, like we discussed earlier. And how I like to do it as far as the whole mesocycle or block, I'll keep the exercises the same for the 4-week block for the month, but I'll progress intensity and volume within that block. And the next block, I'll have a decision to make on what the main focus of that block will be. And of course, that's when I'll change up the exercises so that you're changing it up enough within the macro cycle to keep it interesting and to drive adaptation, but you're also keeping it similar enough for the consistency's sake of also driving adaptation and knowing how things are progressing over time, because you're going to be monitoring it, measuring it. That's why you program, right? To understand, hey, what improvements are being made over time. So it's a great way to track that progress as well. Another principle to discuss is recovery. So recovery is where that tissue adaptation will occur. Of course, you kick things off with the force and load and stimulus that you're putting on the tissue within the workout. And then that recovery during sleep and rest is where the tissue will rebuild. And particularly classically, people think of the hypertrophy adaptation. You're breaking down muscle tissue and you're rebuilding to increase the cross-sectional area of the muscle fibers. So it is very important to prioritize sleep and nutrition, stress management, and deloading as well within a program. So how I like to incorporate deloading within a program too is the last week of a block, I will decrease intensity and volume a little bit, particularly at the end of a particularly taxing or demanding block. So those are some principles that I keep in mind when I'm programming for an individual, and we got to discuss them within the context of periodization as well. That's why I started with the conversation on periodization. So that could be a good foundation to move from, rather than starting with all the little principles to start. But I think it's important to lay that foundation broad and then layer in the principles from there. Now we're going to move into some more of the variables to utilize within a program. We did talk about the adaptations a bit and what you could change in order to best achieve said adaptation. For example, the strength having higher intensity, higher load, lower reps, hypertrophy, higher volume, lower intensity, and what that might look like. So now we're going to go a little bit more into the variables you could manipulate within a program to work on certain goals by producing desired amounts of stress to the tissues. So first one we'll roll with is frequency, is how often a stimulus is being applied. So this will come into play as well with the training age and how much the person has done in the past, what their current tolerance and capacity is. So of course, the general guidelines for Americans for exercise is the 2 to 3 times of resistance training per week, and then the 90 to 120 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic exercise or cardiorespiratory exercise, and then 70 or 75 minutes of intense cardiorespiratory exercise. So that's just the general guideline for Americans to, hey, this is how much they deem it necessary to be a healthy adult, right? So whatever you can start with, though, is where you should begin. Meeting people where they're at is so important, not only with exercise programming, but just life in general. Another variable to talk about is volume, which we talked about earlier, which is a primary driver of hypertrophy and great for laying the foundation for development of strength and other adaptations. And then we have tempo. That's another one I wanted to discuss as well. The tempo in which you're executing a exercise. We'll briefly discuss concentric, eccentric, and isometric real quick. So the concentric phase of the movement is the portion of the movement where the muscles are shortening in the contraction. Eccentric is where the muscles are lengthening. So you can think of this as in a squat, you're coming up, pushing the floor away from you. That is the concentric portion of the movement. The eccentric portion of the movement is when you're lowering yourself down to the floor. And then that isometric contraction is not necessarily a portion of the movement unless you are staying still. So isometric contraction is when the muscles are remaining the same length during a contraction, and that's if you're doing a hold during a exercise. And when we're talking different portions of a movement or lift, there is also what's called the amortization phase, which is that kind of quick stretch shortening cycle between the concentric and eccentric phase. This is more commonly trained actually within plyometrics to be quick and reactive to movement, but not necessarily trained within other contexts or adaptations. So you can simply, for the concept of tempo, change how slow or quick you are executing certain portions of the movement. The eccentric portion of the movement is where you get a lot of strain to the tissues and disruption of the muscle fibers themselves. So that is heavily utilized within hypertrophy settings, but you got to be wise with how much you are incorporating that into your training and being sure you're recovering well from that. So tempo can be great to really increase the time under tension. It can be great for working on force production, like really quick concentric and quick stretch shortening amortization phase of the movement, as well as working on control if you're trying to just generally move slow and really work on full range of motion, muscle control, the neuromotor recruitment, things like that. And one variable to talk about is exercise selection and exercise order of the exercises there. So of course, exercise selection is dependent upon the skill level, adaptation, desired, the location of the macro cycle. If you're close to the season, if you're working with an athlete, of course, you want those to look more sport specific. So I didn't want to spend too much longer on exercise selection in this conversation today, but maybe I can have a longer podcast about it potentially. But the exercise order from a programming standpoint, generally you want to start with more of the complex compound movements, generally prioritizing the higher skill, higher power, higher strength exercises first, and then getting into more of the volume-based work, accessory work, conditioning work later on in the workout. And again, it doesn't have to look like that. Generally speaking, the adaptation you're wanting to drive is the one you will put first within the workout. The body is fresh, you're not fatigued, and you're able to really put more intent into those movements and exercises there. So I'll round that portion up there with different variables to manipulate within the program. I'll end that conversation there. Of course, there's more that could be discussed, but those are just some big ones I wanted to bring up for the purpose of this conversation here. Alrighty, those were some variables that you can manipulate within a program, and there's certainly more. However, I will end that portion of the discussion there. I'm now going to move on to just some general questions to ask yourself, kind of the questions I like to ask myself when I'm running a program, before I write a program, to kind of round out the programming conversation here today. So at this point, we discussed definitions of programming, different styles of periodization, different adaptations you can work on in a program, how that might look, fitting that into a program. We looked at different principles of programming, and then variables to manipulate within a program. So just some questions to keep in mind, just to keep these at the top of your head when you're thinking about creating a workout or a program for yourself. Ask yourself, what goal am I trying to achieve? What adaptation am I trying to create? Rather than simply asking what exercises should I put in? No, you don't start there. You start with the goal, the why, what you're actually doing, what you're training for. And of course, you ask yourself, where am I at? Where is this individual at? What's their current capacity, and where are we going to begin? And you start there, and then you fill in the pieces from there, how you might progress within a macro standpoint. So what is currently limiting the adaptation, and where are we going to begin? So from there, you ask yourself, what is their schedule look like? What are constraints or barriers that they have with executing exercise? And how can I most effectively piece something together to help them achieve this goal? And one final point is, how will you measure progress? So that's a big thing about actually drafting a program, writing a program, and executing a program is you are going through different blocks within a broad program, ending at a certain goal. You got to understand how you're going to measure progress. What am I going to measure? If it's strength, how much are you lifting? If it's hypertrophy or volume, how many repetitions am I able to execute? What's the lean body mass look like? Am I actually increasing muscle mass, cross-sectional area of the muscle? If it's losing weight, again, what is the fat mass versus lean mass? You're having these check-ins to see, hey, am I actually making the desired changes with implementing this program? Am I actually moving the needle on the goal? So those are some questions to keep in mind when you are writing a program. Those are the things I keep in mind when I'm writing a program for somebody. And it really just helps with keeping your ducks in a row, but also letting the individual know that you truly care for them and that you're wanting to make this the best possible program for them. And it's going to be individualized. It's going to be the most specific program to achieve their specific goal. Again, specific adaptations to impose demands in a way that is progressed accordingly, in a way that won't risk injury, in a way that is safe and healthy and effective. This is all ways to help increase the confidence of the individual as well to actually step into the program and execute it effectively and efficiently. So lastly, just I'm going to close with perhaps some common programming mistakes, and I'll just kind of rattle them off just to give you an idea of, hey, what are some common mistakes out there if you might be making them. So mistake number one would be constantly changing exercises without progression. Again, you want to, if you're performing exercise, you ought to have a goal, right? So if you are constantly cycling through exercises and not tracking anything, then how do you actually know you are achieving the goal that you are wanting to achieve? So it's good to keep a set of exercises, pick a certain variable you're wanting to progress and progress that and measure that over time. And of course, change exercises up within reason, within a certain appropriate time frame. There's many different ways to go about it, like I said earlier. Another common mistake would be prioritizing novelty over adaptation. Same sort of concept with always trying to do something new, always trying to do something fresh, always going above and beyond. But sometimes the basics help. Sometimes the basics work great, right? Nothing new under the sun, no reason to make it too complex. There are sometimes complex solutions needed for complex scenarios and complex adaptations, and that's okay, but no need to reinvent the wheel, no need to stress yourself out with trying something new all the time. So another common one that I see a lot, especially within certain demographics, is pushing yourself incredibly hard every single workout, redlining every workout, all or nothing every single time, and there's a time and place for that. There's a time and place to go 110%. If you are working a particular energy system that requires all out effort, really short duration. If you are training for an event that has components of that, yes, work hard. If you are building muscle, trying to work on increasing cross-sectional area of the muscle, yes, that takes working muscle to fatigue. However, if you're doing things like this every single time, then you're really not giving your body the opportunity to recover and actually build toward said goal or adaptation. So there's a time and place for it. And if you're doing this, then you're not actually helping yourself towards your goal. You're overtraining and overreaching and just digging yourself into a deeper hole of fatigue and not true adaptation. So I'll end you with this. Those are some mistakes that I see with programming. There's certainly a lot more I could go into with those mistakes. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. I'm here for you. I want to be a resource if you have any sort of questions, whether that's about programming or health, fitness in general. So thank you for listening to the podcast today. Again, I'll end with the kind of main concept of the talk, which was every exercise program is simply an organized manipulation of stress to create a desired adaptation. So understand the adaptation, understand where you're at, understand basic programming principles, and have fun with it. It is truly an art and joy to get to piece programs together and find out what works best for you. Everyone's different. Everyone's program ought to reflect that. So go out there, have fun, piece some exercises together in order to form workouts together within a week. Have fun exploring. If you want, make a whole general macro cycle, fill in the pieces from there. If you do have something you're working toward, if you have any questions on how to do so, reach out to me. And then I also have programs on kingdomstrengthinstitute.com. If you have something you're training for, I have pre-built programs there. And I also do one-on-one coaching if you want more of a detailed plan and accountability with the plans as well as nutrition plans, exercise plans. Have something for you if you do happen to be interested in that. And I'm running some discounts right now on the website. If you want to go check them out, I'll have the link to the website in the show notes. So that is the episode today. Thanks for tuning in. It was all about exercise programming. Like I said, it might have been a bit scattered because I just rolled into this thing and I'm like, all right, I'm talking programming and we'll see where it goes. So hopefully you got at least something out of the conversation today. And if, like I said, if you have questions or want to hear anything in the future with this podcast, send it my way via email at coach@kingdomstrengthinstitute.com. Until next time, wishing you a blessed rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next episode. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to catch the next 2 episodes of this series about programming. Speaking of programs, I will be coming out with a very new service with Kingdom Strength Institute. It'll be a individualized, pre-built program service. I've had a lot of people inquire about a middle ground between the traditional pre-built programs that I have on the website, as well as my one-on-one monthly coaching. So this is a great blend for people that want a little bit more details and personalization than the pre-built programs, but don't quite want the accountability and all the extra things that the one-on-one coaching tiers offer. So this is just an announcement that this service will be coming soon. If you feel like it is right for you, I'm accepting pre-registrants where I will be getting you on a list and sending out a discount code if this is something you are interested in. I'll have the link in the show notes where you can find the link to register for the pre-registration. And of course, if you have any questions, I'll have my email in the show notes. Feel free to reach out.